When I come to you, through my pain, can you see me through? As I walk back toward your way, you come running and I hear you say, welcome home, my child. Welcome home, where you belong. Welcome home, my child, in my arms, forgiven. Welcome home.
Welcome. I'm so glad you decided to join me today. I'm Alex Torch Kumpf, and I am glad that you're with me today. You belong here. You are welcomed here. You belong in God's house, and God has a purpose and a destiny for you. And today we're going to talk about choices. I want to start off in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 19. And it says, "This day I call heaven and earth as a witness against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Now choose life." You know, I love that because God gives us the opportunity to make decisions and choices in our life. You know, every day we need to make choices. Do we choose right or do we choose wrong? Do we choose God's way or do we choose our own? Our lives is a total sum of our choices. But because we're not perfect and because we don't have it all together, a lot of our morality and choices are just jaded. You know, I think of people in life. You know, someone chooses to eat McDonald's and Dunkin' Donuts but never exercises. You know, a spouse chooses to have an affair. A person intoxicated chooses to get behind a wheel and drive. A suicide bomber chooses to strap on a vest. A businessman chooses to be motivated by greed. He lies and manipulates and walks over people to climb the corporate ladder. A student chooses to cheat, and someone dealing with guilt still chooses to live in the past in their own regrets. But what happens in that? The person that eats McDonald's every day, they're still never satisfied. The spouse who chooses to have an affair, they're still lonely. A person intoxicated and chooses to drive drunk not only feels guilt afterwards, but that can lead to some fatal consequences for not only himself, but for other people. A businessman who chooses to manipulate and lie and climb the corporate ladder still finds that the top of that ladder is still empty. You know, a student who chooses to cheat, you know, never trusts themselves, and the people around them never really trust them either. And someone dealing with guilt still never finds that forgiveness by trying to relive the past in their mind. See, this is why we have to understand that our choices are so important, because our choices lead to consequences. And sometimes those consequences will lead us to places that we do not want to go. You know, it reminds me of a story when I was younger. And I made a really bad decision. I made a really wrong choice. And when I was about 11 years old, you know, I like to play out in the woods and I like to do sports. I like to do a lot of outdoor things. And one day I get this genius idea of wouldn't it be cool to build a zip line in my backyard. So I go through my garage and I find, you know, different things. And the one thing I could find was a big, thick rope. And I said, oh, this will be perfect. And so I climbed this tall tree in my yard and I go about 30 feet up and I tie this rope to one of the branches. And then I climb down the tree and I take the rope and I'm all excited and I go quite a few feet away and I go and tie it to a lower tree. And so I look around my yard for something that could work as a pulley and I find this PVC pipe. So I decide to run this rope through this PVC pipe and we can, you know, scale down this rope by this PVC pipe. Now, I know what a lot of you are thinking. You're like, this is not a good idea. This guy did not pass physics. This guy had trouble with science. But you know what? I'm 11 years old and I don't care. You know, this is fun. This is awesome. So I get the neighborhood kids together and we climb this tree and we hold on to this PVC pipe and we're just, you know, flying down this rope and just having a good time. Well, one day I get this genius idea. And I decide, wouldn't it be awesome if I decide to sit on the PVC pipe? Now, I know a lot of you are thinking, this is not a good idea. This cannot end well. So I climb up this tree and I saddle myself on this PVC pipe. I undo the rope and I start flying, but I don't go too far because, as you know, that PCV pipe just flips over and I start flying through the air. And I know we're not meant to fly because we don't have wings, but for 5 seconds of my life, I was flying. And I went to a place that I did not want to go, and it hurt bad. See, that reminds us of our decisions that we make. That we just make decisions that lead us to places that we don't want to go. You know, that makes us wonder that, sometimes we need to focus on God's decisions for our life and what He has in His Word. Proverbs 14:12 reminds us that there is a way that seems right to man, but in its end is the way of death. It's the way of ruin. See, we can't make right decisions without God because we don't understand everything. We don't have it all together, but God does. God knows everything. He knows the entire future, and half the time we can't even figure out what to order on a menu. And we have to tell the waiter to come back, 2 to 3 times because we're still indecisive. Most of the time we can't even figure out what to wear the next day. So how in the world can we say that our decisions are better than God's? And when it comes to our storms of life, we have to decide if we're going to let that storm overpower us and overcome us, to succumb us, that we're going to be in ruin because of that storm. Are we going to let that storm pull out our highest potential and have us come near God and find conquering victory over that storm? I love what Elizabeth Edwards said. She said she stood in the storm, and when the wind did not blow her way, she adjusted her sails. There's a woman who said, it doesn't matter what this life throws at me. It doesn't matter what challenges come my way. I'm not going to be overpowered by the storms, but I'm going to overpower the storms. So we got to remember that. We got to remember that God wants to bring overpowering strength and victory to our storms. Paul said this in 2 Corinthians 7:10. He said, distress that drives us to God does that. It turns us around. It gets us back in the way of salvation. But those who let distress turn them away from God are full of regrets. Are we letting our storms draw us toward salvation or drive us into self-condemnation? We have a decision to make. We have a choice to make. God gave Adam and Eve a choice and said, look, you can eat of all the fruit in the garden, but do not eat of this one tree. Now, why did God say that? Was it about eating of a tree? No. In other words, for God to give us an authentic relationship, we had to make a choice. And God did that through a tree. But what was the real sin? Was it really of eating from a tree? No, because Satan came and disguised himself and said, look, you can eat of all the trees of this garden, but did God really tell you that you can not eat of this tree? And then Satan says something that's really crafty and really deceptive and gets the human mind wondering and imagining, because he says, no, God's keeping something from you, because if you eat of this tree, God knows that you will become like Him. See, that was a sin, is for the first time humanity realized that they could become like God, that they could take the divine throne. And so they ate of the tree, they disobeyed God, and a bad choice led to horrible consequences. And they were removed out of the garden. See, what we need to do is we need to learn to rely on God's choices. That's why God wrote this in Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5. And I'm going to go there real quick. And, Solomon was a guy who had a wisdom, but he didn't always make right decisions. And God told him to not marry all these wives, and he did. And those wives manipulated Solomon into worshiping other gods, into making some bad decisions that brought some bad consequences to his kingdom. But at one time, Solomon did trust God, and he said this in Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5. He said, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make your paths straight. how do we make good decisions? How do we keep ourselves from making decisions that lead us into fatal consequences, into ruin? Is we trust in the Lord and we lean on His understanding and not our own. Now that's all the time we have for today, and I'm so glad you decided to join me. Next week we're going to talk about, why we shouldn't blame God for our storms, and we're going to talk about overpowering the storm. So I want you to join me next week, and I look forward to talking to you.
Welcome home.